Hi, and welcome back to my channel and my Michael Powell retrospective. And today we reach the life and death of Colonel Blimp. I have not watched this film for many years and I'd forgotten what an absolute masterpiece it is. One of the very few undisputed masterpieces of British cinema. An extraordinarily rich, epic, detailed, beautifully characterised film. And what this film shows, it was made in 1943. It was the first full Archers production with that wonderful colour logo, the archery target. It shows a quantum leap forward for Michael Powell. Up to this point, we've seen a great director making some great little movies. Now, the auteur, Michael Powell, is fully formed and just roars. This is an incredibly ambitious and confident movie, both from Powell and from Pressburger. It sees huge advances in both of their techniques. Pressburger's script is beautiful. It is so literate and ambitious, the way it combines the history of England from the early 1900s, its view of politics. It has a love story which is complex because it goes across three different women who are all sort of aspects of the same person. It's so ambitious. It covers three conflicts, it covers dueling, and it's also a piece of propaganda. And Pressburger never ever fails. He keeps it all together. It's tonally beautiful. It's so complex and adult. It's a really beautiful piece of script writing. And Powell measures up as a director. As a director, Powell here hits the ground running. First of all, it's his first production in colour. He'd previously worked in colour with the same cinematographer, Georges Perrinal, on The Thief of Baghdad, but here it's him on his own as director. And he really uses colour so brilliantly. And you'll notice in the credits, a little name pops up for the first time. The assistant cameraman was Jack Cardiff, who actually worked on that famous sequence with the heads of game animals on the wall. We'll talk about that in a moment. So the real crew of Michael Powell's team is coming together, and the use of colour in this film is so beautiful. And another very important member of the team is Alfred Junger, the German production designer, who designs all the sets and so on. And they're a very important part of this film. And it's interesting here because what happens to Powell in this film is he demonstrably changes his style, right? Blimp is a very theatrical film. And I don't mean that in a critical way. For some reason, as Powell becomes an auteur, theatricality comes into his work in a good way, in a way that mixes up cinema and theatricality in a really dynamic and interesting way. I've talked before on this channel about how the keynote of English art, in literature, in painting, is theatre. And theatre comes into Powell's art, and we'll see this develop later on in films like The Red Shoes and Tales of Hoffmann, where Powell goes for this complete art form idea of film, which mixes up music and theatre and painting and sets all together. And we first see it really in Blimp. And so many of the sequences, Powell pulls back his camera to take in the entire set, and everyone is in long shots so you can see their whole bodies. And he does entire sequences like this. So when he wants to suggest, like there's a problem in the British Embassy in Berlin, he pulls back right to the end of this corridor set and has people walking across it in almost like a sort of farce, like a theatrical farce. And you can see by how hurried their movements are and how frenetic their movements are, the problems that are going on. When he stages the famous duel sequence, he does all the build-up of the duel. You start in this huge gymnasium set, which is filmed almost like a cathedral. And that's true of many sets in the film. Later on, the convent set will be filmed like a cathedral. And you start off with this expansive view of the cathedral, and then you'll move into it. And the close-ups have more power because there's less of them, and there's more concentration on the master shot. So in the gymnasium sequence, you start with this extraordinary shot, these small men in this great space, and we move down into the space, and then we have the extraordinarily theatrical orchestration of the duel, almost farcical, teetering on being farcical. We come to the point of the duel, the point of tension, and then Powell, and this is how confident he's become as a filmmaker, breaks it. And the camera starts pulling up, And the duel is done almost like a theatrical dance, a sort of forward, forward, back. And it's, it's not staged realistically at all, and it's not an action sequence. The camera pulls up, and then suddenly we find ourselves outside the gymnasium, outside in this beautiful, snowy Berlin landscape. And time again, Powell does this when we go into the convent scene later. The convent is shot in immense depth. So you've got this beautiful matte painting at the back, this kind of labyrinthine convent, and then a huge set of a refectory dining room, and then you move into that set. So Powell does this throughout the film. What he also does is we start to see Powell the auteur really manifesting himself in his treatment of time. And the way that time is treated in this film is fascinating. So right at the beginning, there's the sequence with the attack in a Turkish bath, when some of the army regulars, they're in an exercise against the Home Guard. And the Home Guard have said, right, this exercise begins at midnight. And the regulars think, we'll catch them on the hop and we'll start it at 6 o'clock, right? Because this is a war and you don't follow rules. So they go into this Turkish bath where Blimp is bathing. And Blimp gets angry with them, punches the sergeant, plunges into the water of the Turkish bath. The camera moves on, right, in one shot. And then we see the young Blimp, we've gone back 40 years, climbs up out of the bath. One of the first great uses of time dilation. This will be something that we'll see in Powell's work many, many times. Much copied since, it has to be said. Later on in the film, to show this gap in Blimp's life where he's lost the woman he loves and he goes off into the wilderness, really, of his, adult life. And what this is expressed purely in one room and one set where, year after year, the head of game animals that he's shooting in the jungles or deserts of Africa appear on the wall. So there's a rhinoceros, boom, an antelope's head, boom, an elephant's head, boom. And that's how the film shows 10 years of his life. And later, in a very beautiful sequence, his marriage to his wife is shown through a photo album and the invitations to balls and dinners. And her hand is turning over the photo album. And then, as she keeps turning, the pages become blank, and we superimposed see a newspaper article saying that she's dead, but the hand keeps turning the pages, all those years of photos that will never happen. A beautiful piece of work, actually. And eventually the film ends with a gap, where his house that he was with his wife stood. It has now been blown away, and we'll come to that at the end of this video, because it's very beautiful. So Powell is he's revved up here, he's the true auteur. This is a very complex and beautiful film. I can't really cover it in one video. So for the rest of this video, I want to concentrate on one aspect of it which really, really, really interests me, and that is its propaganda value. I'm very interested in British wartime propaganda. I've written about it for the BFI, and so it's something that's of interest to me. Now, some of you may know that Blimp was hated by Churchill. He wanted to get the film banned. And this is one of the rare times in film history where a film producer is a hero, because J. Arthur Rank actually protected Powell and Pressburger, let them work completely independently, and put the film on against Churchill's wishes in Rank cinemas. So producer as hero, they can be good sometimes. Churchill wanted this banned. Now why? Well, really, it's quite obvious. Blimp, Colonel Blimp, was a character created by a cartoonist called David Lowe. And it was a caricature of the old style, buffer gentleman soldier. Things aren't like they were in my day, that kind of thing. It's a sort of gentle piss take. And so you might think that Colonel Blimp is a sort of satire, a bit of a comedy. And that's how it's characterised in some film guides. It is not. It is a very moving and complex and epic film. What Powell and Pressburger did was to take this kind of caricature and turn it into a real person and think, well, where has this person come from? Now, so what we see at the start of the film is the regulars and the Home Guard in contest with each other. A young soldier telling an old soldier, you are out of date and we're taking over. This is a total war. So right from the beginning, Churchill, that the main character of the film is a buffer old soldier who's a figure of fun, and it shows the regulars and the Home Guard against each other. So of course Churchill's going to be predisposed towards it. But that's not all. Let's look at this film in its entirety. Then what happens? What happens is the film goes back to 1902, the Boer War in South Africa, where Roger Livesey, the Colonel Blimp character, has been fighting. And what happens is a woman contacts him from Berlin, an Englishwoman, saying the German papers are spreading propaganda. They're saying that the British are killing women and children in South Africa, and they are using concentration camps. Because, of course, concentration camps are historically thought to have first been used by the British in the Boer War in South Africa, not by the Germans in the 1930s and 40s. This is an extraordinary thing for a British film to bring up in the 1940s. Now, Blimp, being a true Englishman, proud, very patriotic, wants to go to Berlin and tell them that they're wrong. It's a very interesting scene. He goes to see a British diplomat, and the British diplomat doesn't tell him that these things are not wrong. That's an interesting aspect of Pressburger's script, which I don't think is picked up enough on. Throughout this film, Powell and Pressburger show British bureaucrats and diplomats not in a positive way, not in a negative way, but certainly not in a positive way. And one of the lines that this diplomat has when he's telling Blimp don't get involved is don't get involved with politicians. And of course Churchill was a politician. People often think that Powell was a flippant director, that he was a light-hearted director. This is a mistake. Powell and Pressburger were very cute, very intelligent directors. They knew what was going on in Britain in the Second World War, and they were very critical of it. And we're going to watch a film, The Small Back Room, later on in this retrospective, where you'll see one of the most bitter condemnations of how the British bureaucracy and diplomats conducted the Second World War. And we start to see it throughout this film, right? So Blimp is told not to go and not to get involved. And nowhere does the film specifically state that what the Germans are saying is wrong, but that it's propaganda. That's the first point. Now, after this episode where Blimp becomes friends with a German officer, and the German officer is seen as the most intelligent and articulate person throughout the entire film, another reason why Churchill may not like it, we then go forward to the First World War. And the First World War is not represented patriotically. It's represented as a bit of a rainy, gloomy disaster. At one point, Blimp goes into an American station and says, I need a train to get out of here. And the Americans are clearly contemptuous of him, right? And at one point he says, in this war, I've seen, there's there's supply places without any supplies, there's radios without any radio signals, or something like this. But basically calling attention to how badly run the war is. How little the British Army had that they should have had. It's a criticism of the First World War effort. Churchill was part of that. He wouldn't have liked that. And he might not have liked the way the relationship between the Americans and the Brits, where the Americans are seen to be quite sort of affectionately contemptuous of the Englishmen. At the end of the First World War, we have a sequence in a prisoner of war camp in Britain. How little the prisoner of war camps that Britain had for Germans and Italians in the First and Second World War is ever shown in British media. Powell and Pressburger showed it during the war. It's extraordinary. And then Anton Walbrook, the German character who Blimp befriends, is then seen, he's invited by Blimp to a dinner with British bureaucrats, British businessmen, British diplomats, and they are seen from Walbrook's point of view. He sees them as cold and stupid. He thinks that you can just stop a war and that just stops everything. The game's over, the test match is over, the cricket game is over, it's been won or lost. No, war goes on. And he has this extraordinarily bitter speech to his other officers about how these British people are stupid. They think that war is a game of cricket. Later, the Anton Walbrook character comes back to Britain as a refugee from the Nazis, and Walbrook has given this extraordinarily beautiful speech, so deeply moving, which to this day I think is one of the great pieces of acting on film. He just sits on a chair and delivers it very quietly. It's about 8 minutes long and it's so moving. about how his life has been destroyed by Nazism. And he says, I was wrong to think what I thought back in 1919. But Pressburger and Powell have left that idea in the air that the British didn't really learn the lesson of the First World War, and that what they did to Germany may have caused some of the enmity that Germany is now in Germany and in the German psyche. That's left hanging in the movie, right? For almost 10, 15 minutes. Churchill would not have liked that. And then in the end, we see the downfall of Blimp. He goes to the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, and they treat him with immense coldness. This great avatar of British soldiering is just chucked out and humiliated, and he's forced into resignation. Running throughout the film also is a love story. The love story is important. It's a crucial part of the film. What happens is, when Blimp goes to South Africa at the beginning, he meets a woman played by Deborah Carr. Deborah Carr in her first big role. She's so beautiful and so brilliant. She plays these three different avatars of the same woman so brilliantly. I should just speak about the acting quickly. Roger Livesey, one of the great performances in film, and he wasn't originally going to do the part. Laurence Olivier would have done it with all his bombast. Laurence Olivier is a great actor, but he's slightly too proud. Livesey just invests himself. He just gives himself to the role. And of course, Walbrook is magnificent as the German friend. Three brilliant performances. Anyway, so at the beginning, he meets this woman in Berlin, and through circumstances, she falls in love with the German friend. And in a brilliant piece of staging by Powell, it's so beautifully directed, when Roger Livesey hears this news, he jumps on his bed like a little boy who's been told by his friend something exciting. It's a beautiful piece of direction and acting. And then he warmly congratulates him, he suppresses his feelings. They go upstairs, they both play, and they put on her hats and make themselves feminine. And this beautiful scene, when he's giving away this woman he loves, so he doesn't realise he loves her yet, is played as almost half comically with him wearing her hat. Beautiful sequence. Then he realises he loves her. And he spends all his life trying to replace her. So when he sees a nurse in the First World War who looks like her, he immediately starts dating her, simply because she looks like the Deborah Carr he knew. And similarly, he will pick his driver in the Second World War, purely based on the fact that she looks. And Walbrook, throughout the film, is made to seem more intelligent. He sees this. And he says this beautiful line of dialogue to Blimp. He says, you know, you just remained her as an ideal, but I lived with her for 30 years. We had children together. And there's this sly sense that Blimp, even in love, is not mature, he's not adult. Whereas Walbrook sees the truth of things. It's a very beautiful and moving scene. So again, all of these things suggest that Blimp is a fool, and Churchill would not have liked that. Let's talk, this is a very long video, isn't it? But let's talk now about British propaganda in totem. There's 4 things about British propaganda that I think are really, really interesting. The first one was what a lot of the propagandists and the Ministry of Information tried to wrestle with. They had to tell people in Britain that this is not a cricket game. The normal rules don't apply. This is not about sportsmanship. This is a death machine. It is coming to kill us, and it is not going to follow any rules. It doesn't care about our rules or our sense of fair play. It's going to crush us. So in order to beat them, we have to become like them. This is a very powerful message in British propaganda throughout the 40s. We see it in Alberto Cavalcanti's magnificent little movie, Went the Day Well, where a village is invaded by Nazis, and the women of the village have to use terrible means to fight back. In one scene, the local telephonist hacks a man to death with an axe. Wonderful scene. In this film, we start, and the film starts watching some British soldiers, but they're not on horseback, they're not parading, they're on motorcycles. They are roaring through the English countryside to jazz music, modern sounding American style jazz. They seem like an intrusion. They seem like something new in this peaceful English countryside, and they are going down to London to catch an old trusted soldier off guard. And when they do catch him, they berate him and they say, "You are a fool and we are the new army." And what they've done is they've not followed his order that the exercise begins at midnight. They've said, well, in total war, in a war where you're taking on people like the Nazis, you don't follow rules like that. You catch them beforehand. So the movie sets this tone right at the beginning, and then right at the end, Anton Walbrook has a second brilliant speech where he says to him, "You don't understand. To beat the Nazis, you're going to have to be like the Nazis." And this is a very powerful message in the film, because at the end, Blimp realises that Anton Walbrook is right. But in the very last scene, which is heartbreaking, he's with Anton Walbrook and Deborah Carr outside his destroyed house. And one of the things he said to his wife is, "We will be here till the second flood, right? And this house will have a lake in the basement." This kind of poetic piece of shorthand he has with his wife. Well, his house has been bombed. The authorities have put in a water tank, so now it's flooded, and that's all that's left. And an autumnal leaf floats along, representing Blimp. And Deborah Carr's character says, very moving, he says, "You know, these new men are like you. They were cocky like you were in your youth and did things. But will they grow into a grand old man like you?" And that is a powerful statement. Is turning into being like the Nazis to fight them turning us into Nazis? And this brings me to a second part, a crucial theme of British propaganda during the Second World War. Not just what we've been, what we need to become now in the present, but what we will become in the future. We see this in Humphrey Jennings's beautiful, very moving documentary, A Diary for Timothy, where the whole film is not really about the war. It's about what we're working towards. Why are we fighting this? What are we going to become? And many people have said about this film that its portrait of Britain before the First World War is nostalgic. It's nostalgic for a time of chivalry and honour and duels and love, which was shattered, by the First World War and the Second World War. And Powell and Pressburger are looking back before these shattering events to a simpler time. What I find so poignant about this film now is that I feel the same way. I feel that this is looking back to an England that has gone, that is the far side of the rainbow, and that since then it's been shattered. And did we really become the grand old man that Blimp had become? The two other aspects of propaganda that are interesting. The third is that a lot of British propaganda during the war was directed at women, because many of the men were away at war and the women were at home on the home front. So many cinema films were directed towards women because they were the audience, but also to tell women, sort of, in a propaganda way, how they could get involved in the war effort. And this suits Powell because Powell likes strong female characters. And Deborah Carr comes forward here. And the three characters she plays are all really strong. The first wants to get involved in politics. She doesn't want to just be confined to a woman's role. She wants to get involved in things that she cares about and affects her country. And Pressburger gives us some brilliant dialogue. The wife of that Blimp eventually gets has one of the most moving speeches in the film about why are the Germans so capable of creating such beauty, such beautiful music, such beautiful poetry, and then why do they go to war and then just stop and go back to creating beautiful music and beautiful poetry? And that's put in the mouth of Deborah Carr's character. And then her third character, this driver at the end of the war, calls herself Johnny, and she's a spirited woman. She said, "I want to drive, I want to get part of the war," and in many ways she's kind of cheeky and irreverent. So that's another aspect of the film. The fourth aspect of the film is, as well as looking at the present and as well as looking at the future, British propaganda kept looking at the past because it wanted to try to tell people, what are you fighting for? What does Britain mean? Is it a passport? Are you a member of a society or a community? What are you fighting for? So what you see a lot of in these films is that people go back to the past. They bring up the past. So Pressburger goes back to the Boer War and the First World War. But also you see it in elements like, for example, The opening credit sequence is done in the style of a medieval British tapestry, right? To get this sense of a whole sense of England, a whole sense of its history. And that's another beautiful aspect of the film. Okay, this video is now 25 minutes long. It's the longest one I've done on Michael Powell. I could talk about this film endlessly. There's so many things I've forgotten to talk about because it's such a beautiful film. Please watch it. If you've never seen it before, honestly, it is astonishing. It is an absolute masterpiece. I love this film to pieces.